You're very welcome to this, the first ever corporate governance podcast brought to you by the Corporate Governance Institute, providing quality education for the next generation of directors and corporate leaders. This podcast is about exploring what's new in governance, what are the challenges, where are the opportunities, and how do we make the most of them. I'm your host, Dan Byrne, and we're thrilled to have as our first ever guest, Dr. Marianne Roux, Consulting Director with 30 years global experience in the governance arena. Marianne currently runs Roux Consulting, global niche consulting firm based in Dublin, Ireland, and she also has an active worldwide teaching career. Her CV spans several industries and includes past work with big corporate names such as PwC, Accenture, Deloitte, and Mercer. Her work focuses mainly on leadership development, organisation redesign, HR transformation, and the future of work strategy, which is exactly what we are going to talk about today. Because in this time of intense change and the culture around leadership needs a proper examination to adapt properly. Marianne, absolutely fabulous to have you here with us, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's wonderful to join you and talk about some of my real passions.
Great. Yes. Well, let's go straight into the passions. And I'd love to start actually, before we get into the nitty gritty, if you could just tell us a little bit more about your governance career. What have been your main motivations and your main achievements over the years?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look back 30 years, I only realized I had a squiggly kaleidoscope career when I kind of look back on it. And what that really means is that you look through things that drive, purpose, adapt to new things. I'm just infinitely curious. I think that's the first thing. I'm infinitely curious. And I realized over the 30 years, maybe it's being born in South Africa in a complex, fast-changing place, that I really like looking at things systemically, and I like to wrangle with complexity and uncertainty and try and help make sense of it for people. And I think that's what's driven my career for consulting firms. Of course, when you're in consulting, you're often presenting to boards. You're often seeing the strategy gone wrong. You're often seeing what needs to happen. You see the overruns of projects. So that gives you really great insight. And then as an HR director, of course, you have so much board interaction because you're forever presenting to the Remuneration and Benefits Committee and working with the nominations committees. And you get a lot of board exposure that way. And then as a business school professor, working at every level of leadership and just seeing the real challenges that boards and excos have with each other over the years, and it's getting so much worse. So that's really where all my interests started to come from. And I started on my first actual board role, always being on the side of boards, either presenting to them or working with them, in 2016, when I was asked to join the board of the Edmund Rice Foundation, Australia. And it was a wonderful experience because I was the only person from Africa, and people were developing skills in Africa. And it was very important for me that, when I look at board skills assessments sometimes, I just see some gloriously missing pieces. I was the only board director on there that was from Africa, and nobody had thought about putting that on the list of skills and experiences that maybe we should bring to the board. And then I was on the board of YGAP, another board in Australia that developed social entrepreneurs around the world and women. And again, I was the only immigrant and one of the only people from the countries that they were actually doing the development in. And finally, I was on two more boards, Hagar International, where we work with trauma recovery for slavery and trafficking survivors, both on the side of the fundraising in Australia and also on the side of the international organization where we delivered the programs. And so for board director roles, I like to have several perspectives. I like to have the outside in and the inside out perspective. So for boards, but lots of work with boards over the 30 years, and very interested in how the strategy gets sustainably rolled out and how the governance really works from a systemic point of view, leveraging the best that we can leverage to thrive in the complexity and uncertainty.
And those gaps that you mentioned, when you saw them, did you find that others were well aware of them, or this was something that you sort of stumbled upon and saw these are big gaps here?
The thing that shocked me when I got onto my first board role is when I did look at what board evaluations had been done. Had the board been looking at its own performance? Was it really aware of its skills gaps? How did the board interact with the exco? I was really shocked to see that in most cases, board directors didn't have a board qualification. It was, I always say, the willing and the able. Some were willing and not able. Some were able and not willing.
Yes.
So a lot of people didn't understand that they needed to have a board manual, even understood what committee should be there. So there was this large gap of knowledge, but then there was also not a really good balance of skills and roles. And it was too expert focused. And I see that still today in Ireland when I look at the ads. They're looking for someone with an HR background or, which I understand, maybe an elite athlete or something like that. But I'm not seeing people who are understanding the future of work holistically or understanding governance holistically or who's gone through a massive transformation or gone through a massive scale up or have worked in those countries and have insight into the exact context and the cultures of those countries. And very often we push women, but then we end up with Anglo-Saxon women. So I'm not seeing diversity come through in other aspects that I think is so critical. So I think no is the answer. I think people kind of just try and read the board papers, come to the board, try and make a good decision, often feel okay if they can just half understand the financial figures and can kind of give some expert input from their own expert area, then they feel, okay, well, I've done a fairly good job. But for me, that is not a good job as a board director. For me, that is scraping the barrel of the bare minimum, if you know what I mean.
So it's indicative of a rampant, would you say, call it a tick boxing culture or something like that?
I think so. And I think one of the other problems, if I think of all four of those boards, not one of those board roles that I was in was ever advertised.
Really?
People knew me.
So the networking value is huge.
It was just through the network. Not one of them was advertised. One of my friends was the chair of the first board and said, I really, really need you as the first non-Catholic and the first woman on this board from Africa. And he just had it in him because he said, I just need you on here because it's tricky and you're good with complexity and you're good with strategy and you're good with growth. And the next one, I was the CEO's mentor and she was, I desperately need you on my board. And the next one I did pro bono consulting for, and they said, can you just please come onto the board? So, and what often happens is the same people get cycled through boards again and again and again through the network. And they just miss out on unbelievable talent, diverse talent, people who bring very different perspectives. And so it's a tick box exercise on the one hand, but it's also a comfort exercise in who you know on the other hand very often. I'm not saying everyone is like that, but I still do see that a lot.
Mm. Okay. Well, that comfort thing is something that we're probably going to come to later on in the podcast. My next question was also about the past. If we could look back on the last 10 to 20 years, what are the biggest changes do you think have happened in corporate leadership? And I guess it's a positive question, but you can interpret it as you want. What are the biggest shifts?
Yeah, I study leadership for a living. That's what my PhD is in. My PhD is in leadership fit for the future of work. And I look not just at leadership in the context it's in, because that we've got to understand two things about leadership. One is it's always in context. And if your context shifts, leadership shifts. So we can't say we can lead the same way as we did in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s because we're not in those times. We are in a post-COVID, AI, ESG, complex, uncertain world. And we have to accept that hybrid, flexible world. Skilling, reskilling world, that this is the world you're in. If you cannot make sense of that as a leader and understand how to lead in that, then you are using outdated models and theories. And your leadership development is outdated and not preparing leaders to be future fit. So I think if leadership's not in context, and the second thing is there was an incredible focus in the early days on leadership as an individual. It came out of the US Army. It came out of individual psychology. So it was about me as the leader. As if I'm, this amazing, I have to have all these traits or be this kind of hero or be very, very transformational, charismatic, and you just pick up the book and here's 10 steps to leadership. And it doesn't work that way. Leadership is a social process. It's an interaction between people. And so, absolutely, leadership is a team sport. So I always use this Dennis Hooper quote. Most people think leadership is easy and fun, but the more responsibility you assume, and imagine you're going up exco board level, the more uncertainty you'll be expected to manage. Most people are really bad at that. Uncertainty is not your enemy, but it's the opportunity. And the leader's responsibility in that is to bring clarity in the midst of paradox and ambiguity, and to show up as a team of leaders, and to show up as a human leader, but also to show up as somebody who can drive high performance, high care sustainably. So if you look over, I call it leadership 1.0 to 4.0. If you kind of think about leadership 1.0, a lot of models are outdated. Euro leadership personality test. If I see one more, I'm going to be sick. Leadership is not personality. It's mindsets and practices. You can get better at it all. It's not a set of competencies. It's not hierarchical. It's not for the elite few. You need a leader full organization. But then we went to this lovely fuzzy place of 2.0 and 3.0, which was visionary, charismatic, transformational. And it was just fabulous, empowerment culture. But it doesn't work like that. Leadership 4.0 is shared and human. It's a lifelong journey. You are never actually meeting the end goal of being a leader. It's a lifelong learning journey that you have to learn from in complex contexts and change your habits over time, and that's hard. And at the same time, you've got to update your knowledge and skill of modern business. You have to have digital literacy. You have to be agile and adaptive. You've got to be virtual. You've got to learn how to deal with flex environments. You've got to be purposeful and values driven. Otherwise, your people don't trust you. And you've got to be a lot more willing to listen and speak less. And I think that kind of leadership is not that apparent. People are too uncomfortable to go there. They prefer to just hark back to more controlling, protecting, and complying behaviors. When things become complex, they'll cut costs, they'll restructure, they'll do very linear problem solving in complex adaptive times. And it's time to say, it's okay that I don't know everything. We're in this together. We're all learning, but we'll create the best possible environment and as much clarity, not certainty, clarity as we can in any moment. And I just think how we see leadership and how we develop leaders have got to change quite significantly.
I'm reminded of a statistic that I heard once. I'm not sure of the source, but it said that people remember at least 60-70% of what they say, but only 30 or 20 of what they hear. Do you see elements of that in this need for more listening and more self-reflection?
Yeah, I interviewed 10 leaders for my book, Leadership Fit for the Future Work, 10 leaders that I really think live Leadership 4.0. And there were a few things that really stood out for me. One is that they were all incredibly curious. Yeah, they asked questions. They didn't tell. They asked questions. They wanted to know. They were always, one of them said to me, and he's a chair and a CEO, I spend 50% of every week I make sure I've spent with my people. Not on tasks, not on anything else, but with my people at every level of the organization, listening, making sure we're recruiting the right people, promoting the right people, developing the right people, listening to what our people are saying. So they're curious and they're really, really people-focused, very human-centric, and they are incredibly real. So this same leader, and I've worked with him twice as a client and also for him in his organization when he turned it around. One of the things he says is we've got to stop with all these really, really brand-crafted messages, by internal communications and brand and PR specialists when we talk to our people. He talks from the heart. For example, when he's on an airplane between cities, he writes an email to his people, everyone, every week. Mm-hmm. And he'll say, I'm on a plane. I've just visited this city. Here's what I've seen in the organization. Here's what I'm thinking about. And I'm on my way here now. And it is just beautiful and real, written from him. It's not gone over by anybody in internal communications or in PR. So it's not PR nonsense, because I see a lot of very crafted kind of messaging coming out. And of course, you've got to have good judgment what you say, but just that realness, that curiosity and that human-centeredness, I think creates a lot more trust and it brings out the best in people.
Yeah. It's interesting because to me, it sounds quite liberating, that approach. And, it would be lovely to see if more people do it. What I would wonder is if many people came to you and said, but I'd be afraid of saying the wrong thing off the cuff or of adopting a wrong viewpoint because I'm just speaking from the heart. Is that something that you think, is that a learning curve? Is it something that happens and you just move on? Or is it even an issue?
I worked on, I think there's a set of mindsets and practices that these leaders have continuously worked on to get there, if that makes sense, right? And they have made a lot of mistakes. One of the things I found fabulous about them is that they were not scared of failure. If you read Amy Edmondson-Slate's book, which talks the right kind of wrong, she talks in that book about you have to make mistakes. You are going to say some wrong things and you're going to get some things wrong. Yeah. And if you don't, you're not going to learn. I mean, she talks about the fact that with heart operations, there were quite a few people that died in the first heart transplants. But if you didn't keep doing it, and obviously these are people who made that choice, you would not get to the successful heart transplant. Mm-hmm. And, so the thing is that what I know about these leaders, but what I found fascinating when I asked them what their biggest mistakes were, they could roll them off the tongue. It was like none of this, I'm not going to talk about that. The one guy went, I did this wrong. I went into this country, and I lost millions. And then I went in here and, and I should have let that toxic person go much longer before. And they're just so comfortable that they're just human and that they made mistakes and that they learned from it, and that it's just part of leadership is learning and making mistakes and experimenting. And, I think that is where we learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we need to get comfortable with that. We can't be, I hear people go, oh, Marianne, that's a reputational risk. Oh, Marianne, that's a fear of failure. And that is classic immunity to change stuff. It's classic, I have competing behaviors that compete against the ones I'm actually trying to change. So instead, I want to listen to my people, but instead of listening to them, I'm so scared of not always looking like I have the answer that I always speak too much, for example.
And it makes sense. And I think that we've actually moved on to the one of my next questions, which was sort of the struggles, the bad points of corporate governance today. And, it's extremely interesting to sort of adapt or to see that mindset at work, the fear of failure. If I could flip it on its head and ask if you had a top one or two things that are good about corporate leadership today, is there anything that stands out for you?
As I said, I think COVID forced leaders to become more human, empathetic, and real. I think that, once they saw your cat and your art at home and your bedroom in the background, it wasn't much coming back from that. Yeah. It was very real. And I think that was a good thing. I think, however, people are getting whiplash on the negative side of that, because now we're suddenly going, margins are tight. We have to cut costs and drive productivity. You have to come back to the office. So I think we're losing those gains. Where I see leaders get it are in places like Novartis, where you have a leader that says that he's an accidental CEO and calls his leadership philosophy in the organization unbossing the company. Mm-hmm. You see in Microsoft a leader saying it has to be about growth mindset and curiosity, otherwise we are not going to get there. You just see leaders getting it, younger leaders often getting it. And for me, the mindsets and practices, if I pull them out, that I do see from time to time, is leaders who are willing. My question to everybody on this podcast is, do you even know what the world of work, the future of work means for your organization? As the board and the executive committee got a shared view on what that is and what the impact is. So do you have contextual intelligence? Can you make sense of it for your organization? And do you even have the same sense between your exco and your board? And then how strong is your personal agility and curiosity? How strong is it? Are you willing to ask questions and not know?
And how confident do you think that the average board would be about answering those questions?
I don't think the average board has any point of view on the future of work. Neither does the executive committee. Everybody's just bringing knee-jerk strategies to each other and not sitting down and say, right, what does Industry 4.0, 5.0 mean for us now and in the future? How does that impact our skill sets? What does ESG and DEI mean? What does wellness mean? Are we well as an organization? What does skills-based futures look like? Do we have the right capabilities in our organization if we are going to have, 3 to 5 year shelf life of skills? And what is our exposure there? And what is our build, buy, borrow, partner strategy for people to make sure we have the right people? Do we have the sustainability things in place? And just holistically say, do we have that under control? We've got a shared view. I don't hear those conversations in the board. I see just a lot of board papers coming through with a lot of different projects. And I still have a question as to why boards get so blindsided, as we've seen here in Ireland and other places, by some really important financial information or projects that have gone wrong. So where are we not getting a shared sense of risk even? So if that's our future of work, then what is the risk and what is the risk tolerance and what does the board need to know about? What don't they need to know about and where can they empower? And then really seeing a collaborative effort in making sense of these things and leaning into the complexity. I see a lot more knee-jerk and fear-based short-term responses from both, quite misaligned very often between ExCo and boards. So I think that my first thing I just say is have a shared view of risk and future of work and what the roles are of each and how you're going to make sure that you don't have one of these, blindsided, big reputational risk events happening in your organization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And these questions that you were just mentioning about, they're very future oriented. Is that what you would define as the core of future of work strategy? This is one thing you're very passionate about.
Look, I think future of work strategy is very complex, and I think hybrid work has hijacked it, which is only a part of it. So we have to get away from that. It has 4 components. It is Industry 4.0, which has been here since 2014. You are 10 years behind if you haven't done your digital and AI transformation in your organization. So where are you at with that? Then where are you at with the new ways of working? People expecting flexibility, people expecting wellness, purpose, and things like that in the organization. Where are you at with that? How are you managing this flexible work? How are you productive? How are you delivering results? And then how are you mapping your skills? Nobody has a skills ontology. Do you know what your skills risks look like? Do you know what your engagement looks like? Do you know what the energy and wellness looks like in your organization? And these are all ands. And have you got ESG under control? Do you know what you need to do, what skills you need, what do you know how to measure all 4 of those things so that you as a board have a quick glance of data, real life data that can tell you how you're doing on this future of work and where you are vulnerable and what questions you need to ask. And that is outside of fiduciary oversight, that's strategic oversight and generative insight that the board has got to bring and that the ExCo has got to respond to. And there's a lot of boards I sit in spend the entire time on fiduciary oversight, on budgets, on reputation, on risk profiles. Wonderful. Not a lot of them spend much time, maybe one strategic planning day a year, on strategic oversight and on generative insight to analyze these complex problems and to tackle ambiguous situations.
And do you think there's any 1 or 2 reasons why that lack of appetite persists?
I just think people don't know how to be generative. It's a levels of work issue. If you look at, I spoke about contextual intelligence and personal agility, and of course there's the ethical moral maturity and the ethical reasoning of the board. But the 4th mindset in practice is boards and execs have got to work at an adult development level that's not an expert and that's not an achiever, but is a strategist and an innovator mindset. And that means that you yourself need to be able to work in more complexity and to use systems thinking and not have linear problem solving and black and white thinking at that level. It's much more complex. So for me, the ability is adaptive, complex problem solving. And I teach this. in all my programs. Do you know what your adaptive challenges are? So yes, here's the strategy. So the first thing I usually ask is, what would stop you from achieving the strategy? Right? And then they all have to map the mess around that together and tell me. And then I say, if you look at everything you've mapped there, what is it telling you about the problems you need to solve? The complex problem you need to solve? What are the patterns that are emerging of the things that would stop you from achieving the strategy? Nobody ever does that. They slap the strategy, then they get the budget, then they do the operating plans, and they set the goals, and off they go. Nobody goes, why do we have the same issues pop up every 3 years and we can't solve them? What are the complex adaptive challenges we are not solving that is stopping us from double-digit growth or from achieving X or, collaborating across the firm as one of my clients? I said to them, what stops you from extracting value across the firm? And I did this with several groups. And they came out and I said, now group it for me. Which of these are systems issues? Which are leadership issues? Which are culture issues? Right? So that we get a handle on what are the complex adaptive challenges that we have to solve for to achieve our results. And then we can backcast from our ideal state. What would it look like if it worked? I then ask, right? What would the ideal state be? Human-centered design. What would it look like if we got these things right that we've now talked about? Then I say, now backcast from where you are here to where you are now. Tell me what are all the things that need to be in place and how long will it take you to get there? Now go back to your strategy and your plans and tell me whether it's actually in there. And you know what happens? 50% of what we've just discussed is not in the plan.
Wow.
And that's the problem. Nobody says, hang on, strategy is complex. Strategy execution is complex. The context keeps changing. And we also have to adapt this thinking every quarter. We have to go in and say, right, has the context changed? Have we made any forward movement on these complex issues? Nobody does that. They just come back with fiduciary oversight of the budgets, of the KPIs, right? And that's why I think we also get so blindsided. We are not complex ourselves because we want to come in as the expert or the achiever that just works harder. And we need to evolve our egos so that we can work at higher levels of complexity as leaders.
Well, here's the thing, because what you just described is a wonderfully staged basis, and it really opens up a lot of windows for change. What I'm thinking is, this seems to be at the heart of changing. It really gets to the heart of changing company culture. Culture is a huge thing to change, especially with the urgency that I think you feel we need in today's governance landscape. Is there anywhere, where do we start when it comes to changing our mindset, our outlook in governance to sort of shift the culture towards long-term oversight and that kind of strong outlook?
What if we did a mess map on that, right? A collective mess map. We bring in the stakeholders and we say, what stops us from achieving long-term governance change? From what stops us from becoming generative boards, right? Let's unpack the mess of that. It is messy. Let's unpack it and say, what stops us from achieving this collectively, right? And we say, okay, some of these things look to be fear. Some of these things look to be culture. Some of these things look to be our capability. Some of these things, right. Now let's take that capability. What would it look like if we were capable? Well, these things would be in place. What would it look like if we had the right culture? Well, we'll have these mindsets and practices. What would it look like if we had, a different rhythm to how we do things and what we discuss? Well, it would look like this. And then you say, well, how do we go from where we are now to where we want to be? And you literally develop a plan to step yourself through. And this is what's not happening, right? We're not talking about the things we need to talk about, if that makes sense. We are too linear in our thinking and too short-term in our thinking. So we can't break through. And until we start to take a systems long-term view and start to tackle the things that stop us from achieving what we want to achieve and really understand it deeply and co-create that future, co-create it. Mm-hmm. I'm going to run a conference in a couple of weeks in the US where we're bringing the top people in benefits together in the US. And I'm doing an opening keynote on the future of work in the context. And then they're going into 10 mess map exercises where they are tackling the biggest messy problems. right? What stops us from balancing costs with, all the things employees want? What stops us? Does that make sense? We've got all these questions, and then they come back into the plenary with their insights from those questions about what they think as a collective they need to now work on and what the ideal will look like. And then we are coming out of there, because before, people would sit through presentation after presentation like a board paper after board paper after board paper. We're just throwing it on its head. I'm doing the same in Kuwait in another couple of weeks, where we're just bringing everybody from HR together and going, right, if this is HR futures, what's going to stop us from achieving it?
It's the what's going to stop us outlook. It seems like it just turns an outlook of, I don't know how we even start with changing to where we need to be. And it turns that into a sort of to-do list, which in itself can be, still a lot of work, and there's, it shows you what's ahead, but it's much better than being lost.
I think the key is, once you set what stops us and you rewrite, I always get people to rewrite the problem we're actually solving. Does that make sense? We think this is the problem we're solving. Now we had a look at it, and this is now the actual problem we're solving. What we then do is we go positive. We go, how might we do this? How might we do this? Now, the key with backcasting is a lot of people will just go and do a project plan of 1 year or an operating plan of a year, taking nothing into control of what must actually happen to, as we say, walk the bridge across from the current to the future. When you backcast, you can say, is this realistic? If this needs to be in place and that needs to be in place and this needs to be in place, you do get to where you are now, right? You're walking backwards to where you are now. All you then have to say is, what's the next thing we need to do? What's the next thing you need to do?
How long between, just out of curiosity, how long between the time that people have originally written the problem and rewriting the problem in terms of what they need to solve? What's the temporal gap there?
You're going to not believe what I'm telling you, but we do this in half-day workshops.
Wow.
The entire process in World Cafes and open space technologies, half-day to a one-day workshop.
And that's the half-day window where people get to think through, really engage, I suppose, with the problem that they're facing, so that they have sort of redefined it in their own heads.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I honestly thought it would be more than half a day.
No, because it's a what we call a generative dialogue methodology or open space methodologies. And I think part of our problem, we come from such a Taylorist world where things are so linear and organizations are treated like systems, and they're not. What you will hear I'm saying to you is that things evolve, right? You'd never have a clear answer and plan. You think you have one, and it's good to have a view of where you're going. But you and I both know that even in the last year, if you try to do a budget and a plan, I don't know of a single organization that didn't have a disruptive change of at least 25 to 30% in their strategy, planning, and resources of some kind of event, whether it was a war, whether it was a policy change at a government level, whether it was a further tip, maybe a new entrant, maybe it was, AI bringing a disruptive change in the industry, whatever it was. I don't have a single client that can say to me, Marianne, we know exactly where we're going to be in 3 to 5 years. So I said, let's understand what we want to be, what will stop us from getting there. Let's say what the ideal would look like. Let's backcast and have a plan and start with the first 2 steps, and then stop and learn. Stop and learn.
Yeah. Quickly
redo our exercise and adapt. And one of the things I love as you go further down the organization is to break it down into 90-day agile sprints with key results, right? KRAs.
Mm-hmm.
Or key results so much. I really like OKRs, objectives and key results, right? Break it down to 90-day sprints. Because I find people get so overwhelmed by the complexity of what they have to do, is that we just break it down to 90-day sprints in teams. And we just go, right, at the end of 90 days, where are we? What have we achieved? What have we not achieved? How do we adapt? How we pivot? So it's a whole system that you can easily bring in that is agile, that is systemic, and that is co-created. So the buy-in is much higher and the understanding is much higher right from the start.
Yeah, yeah. And it harks back to that whole thing you were saying about, fostering a willingness to learn rather than just to lead by the 10 steps that you've been given in a book once. I had another question for you on geographical differences. Have you seen any, in terms of the ideal future of work strategy and the not ideal, have you seen any standout countries or jurisdictions where there's more of this or less?
There's definitely a lot of differences, and a lot of it's got to do with the political systems in the country, and a lot of it's got to do with economic and stability of this country. So let's take the Middle East, for example. I've been spending a lot of time in the Middle East. There's a very clear 2030 strategy in Saudi Arabia, driven by the prince, funded by oil money. Massively far ahead, and also have leapfrogged everybody because there wasn't that investment up front. So there's not all that old technology that needs to be replaced. We can go straight with all that oil money to the latest thinking. We can bring in and afford all the latest people, all the latest advisors to come in and do the work, and we can set things up from scratch. Versus countries that are long established, systems are in place, which we have to have change. Margins are tight. There isn't that much investment coming through, right? So you will see a difference in future of work. You'll see the Middle East moving really fast. You'll also see differences in culture. Nigeria is probably one of the places where I've worked with the smartest, most entrepreneurial people in my life that are just not scared of any risks and then just will try anything and that are so digitally savvy. Same in India. Just willing to work, change, try. It's just the mindset, right? Then you come to Europe and it's very different. People are like, oh, but we've always done it like that, and much, much slower, but feeling a little bit under pressure because big environmental focus, big AI focus from an ethical point of view. So trying their best, but probably much slower out of the blocks than I would say even Africa and India and maybe places like the Middle East. Asia, of course, exploding. But big difference between China and the rest of Asia, right? Because of political systems. China has a whole of government strategy, as does Singapore. Singapore is driving a national level skills strategy for 2030, where everybody in the country can get access to just everything for free. That's not happening in other countries. The US, very interesting. Is probably still one of the most innovative and entrepreneurial places, but probably also running the furthest behind because of political disruption and economic disruption. So you see very big differences around the world. But there are a couple of global firms and also startup firms that are just doing this so incredibly well. And Novartis will always be one. Microsoft will always be one. There are some really interesting firms to watch, even in the startup space. But I am seeing a big knee-jerk reaction at the moment in the last year back to much shorter-term thinking and cost-cutting and productivity and return to office mandates and leaders feeling overwhelmed and people being burnt out and kind of a backlash against sustainability and DEI.
Do you think it's a backlash? Do you think it would last as a backlash? Or
absolutely. I'm going to the US now and people are saying to me, don't talk about ESG, don't talk about DEI at the conference. They like swear words right now. And I'm going, that is just bizarre. Absolutely bizarre, right?
Really doesn't have the same hold in other jurisdictions. It wouldn't in the EU anyway.
They're focused on the elections. That is what is in everybody's mind and will be for the rest of this year. And organizations will be scared to make big change in that environment because they don't know what the election outcome is going to be.
And this is, I suppose, speculation at this point, but yes, the backlash is intense against initiatives like that in the US. Do you think they would lead to complete reversal of policies that have been sort of gradually worked in? Or is it a backlash that may fizzle in the end?
I think what I find interesting, and this is just from growing up in South Africa as well, where we had ended apartheid and we had to take action, is that sometimes business carries on regardless of what happens in government, and they just do the right thing. Like a lot of firms that I work with that are in super funds or pension funds will just, they will only invest in companies that are clean and not investing in certain industries, right? And so you start to see the investment dollars speaking louder than the policies, if that makes sense. Or they will only invest in companies that have a certain percentage of women on the boards and on so on. So there's always kind of two things happening for me. There is reversal of policies in the US. We've already seen it. We've seen rights being taken away from people, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some really worrying things happening there. And then on the other hand, you see companies just doing the right thing and putting money where the right thing is. And I'm always just hopeful that people will continue doing the right thing despite a lot of what's happening. And government kind of, I think governments are and are always going to be slightly behind with AI and with all those things. So organizations have got to take the responsibility to say, we know these things are coming. What is our view on AI? What is our view on this? What is our view on that? What do we want to do? What is right for us in terms of our purpose and our values and our strategy? And not be too reactive to that, because government often just, catches up.
Well, you might have answered the very last question that I had for you, but perhaps not. As we come to the end, would there be one key takeaway, or more, if that's what you're thinking, but a key takeaway that our listeners that you'd like them to remember about potentially future of work strategy or something else?
I just, I want people to make sure that as they look at their day and their time and how they're spending it, that they're spending enough time making sense of the future of work, if that makes sense. Reading, asking questions. The best leaders I work with are always listening to podcasts, they're always reading, and they're always asking questions, right? To make sure that they continue to make sense of things. Make sure you are well informed, make sure you are curious. Because if you don't know, people, you don't know what you're looking at. You don't know what questions to ask. So be curious, have a growth mindset. Don't assume that you know how things work. Be open to the fact that it might have changed. Update your mindsets, update your knowledge. Challenge yourself to continue to learn. I do 2 or 3 courses every year. I've just done AI in HR, AI in L&D, because I don't know these things. People think I know stuff. I'm barely half a step ahead of them most of the time. Right? Yep. Make sure you are really making sense of things, and then make sure that you understand what's really happening in your organization. Do you have the skills to achieve, in this context? Do you have the energy in your people to achieve this? Do you have the investments in the right places? Are you prioritizing what's really important? Have a really good, long, dispassionate, detached look at it and say, are we really doing the most important things?
Yeah. And I suppose watch this space for that kind of attitude, hopefully filtering into governance professionals over the next 10, 20 years. It sounds like a long game of change, but something, especially what you said with mess maps and what's stopping us, that kind of thing would help a lot of people, I think, put structure to the whole challenge. Marianne, that's a great note to leave it on. Thank you very much for being our first ever guest on the Corporate Governance Podcast, giving us some food for thought about how we do governance in future. And that's it for the inaugural podcast today. Join us again for the next installment of this new series. And in the meantime, if you're looking to expand your leadership career, quality education in corporate governance and ESG, check out the corporategovernanceinstitute.com and explore the many opportunities we have on offer.